Okay.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Those of you present here in the congregation, those of you watching from abroad. I'd like to start with a humorous story because it connects with my message today. There was a descendant of Pharaoh, had learned that he was going to die, and he called his priest, his doctor, and his lawyer into his room. And he told the three of them that he wanted to be buried in the style of his ancestors and to be buried with some of his wealth. And he hands each of them an envelope and says, in the envelope, to each one of you, is $30,000. And I want you to slip this into my casket before I'm buried, so I can take some of my money with me. And they each agreed to honor his request, as strange as it was. A few weeks later, he dies, and the three men come and place envelopes in his casket before it's lowered into the ground. And after a beautiful ceremony, the three men walk around the cemetery together, and the priest begins pouring tears down, and he says, I must confess something. I felt strongly that he was going to hell for being so concerned about money, so I used $10,000 to help build an orphanage in his name. So the envelope only had $20,000 in it. And the doctor says, I too must confess I donated $15,000 of the money to find a cure for his disease so that others like him could live. My envelope then only had $15,000 in it. And the lawyer looked indignant and said to both of them, I can't believe you guys would spend his money like that and not honor his wishes. My envelope had a personal check for the full amount of $30,000. But the joke tells three different outlooks, right? The priest, the doctor, the lawyer. Three different perceptions on what to do with that request. $30,000 in cash, what am I going to do with it? And each of them have, but I found it very interesting that the lawyer put a personal check in there. Where'd you get to cash it? The Bank of Heaven, I guess. But today I'd like to talk about three different outlooks, three different viewpoints of Israel's slavery in Egypt. I think it's very seldomly talked about, and I think it should be brought out and understood in light of our own situation today. You could say, well, we're not walking around in chains. So I'm looking at the why God allowed his chosen people to be enslaved for more than 400 years. And the question comes to me, why? Why? What do you allow? You've always chosen them. So why would he then have them enslaved for 400 years and allow it to happen? He could have blinked his eye, snapped his finger with the power of thought. It would no longer be, but yet it continued. You know, I once read the story of a marketplace in northern India where people brought their wares to trade and to sell. And one old farmer brought in a whole covey of quail that he had caught. And he hoped to get the attention of passers-by by tying strings to a ring that fit loosely over a stick in the ground to each one of them, and attaching it, strings he tied around the leg of each bird. And he had taught the quail to walk in a circle. But nobody seemed to care. Nobody wanted them. Nobody was interested in them in the market. And then along came a devout Hindu, a holy man from the region, and he believed in the idea of respect for all life, so his heart went out to those birds walking in monotonous circles. And he told the farmer, I want to buy them all. And when he paid for them, he said, now I want you to set them all free. And the farmer looked at him strangely and said, excuse me, what did you say, sir? He said, you heard me. Cut the strings from their legs and turn them loose. Set them free. And the old farmer shrugged. He bent down. He snipped the strings off the quail. And you'd have thought that they'd flown away, but they didn't. They simply continued marching around in a circle. A little frustrated, the Hindu man, shoo them off. Shoo, shoo. They only landed some distance away and resumed their predictable march in a circle. Freed from their bonds, they just kept going round and round in circles as if they were still tied, if they were still chained, still bound. This story, I see the Exodus in this story. The word Exodus, when we hear that word, we think of the second book of the Bible by that name. But we rarely think about what the word itself really means. You see, Exodus means to leave. The book of Exodus is the story of Israel leaving their slavery in Egypt. But they didn't just leave. God brought them out of Egypt with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, and rescued them from their slavery. And throughout the Tanakh, that is the Hebrew Bible, that's a repeated phrase. You know, you look at Leviticus 26:13, God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with your heads held high. And the night before God led them out of Egypt, he commanded them to celebrate the first Passover. And Moses said to them in Exodus 13, verse 3, commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. You see, when God gave Israel his law, the first of the 10 commandments said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. About 40 years later, Joshua, Moses' protege, called the people to make a decision to follow God. And he made his famous statement, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Everybody's heard that before. But part of his speech, not so well remembered, he said in Joshua 24:17, it was the Lord our God himself who brought us, our parents, up out of Egypt from the land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. Over and over and over again, God reminds his people that they were once slaves. But he bought them and he brought them out of that slavery. And the question comes to mind, why allow his people to become slaves to begin with? Why would God do that? Why allow them to be slaves for such a long time? Not 4 years, not 4 months, not 40 years, but more than 400 years. Why didn't God rescue his people immediately? Now we know how they became slaves. Exodus 1, 8-14, we're told that a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing or didn't know came into power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or wisely with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And so they put slave masters or taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramesses and store cities of Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And in all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. But even though we know how they became slaves, there still remains the question as to why allow them to be slaves and then allow them to remain slaves in that harsh, bitter labor. Generations were born and died under the whip. All the more I thought about that, several things became apparent. First, when Israel left Egypt, they had a destination, right? Not like Abraham. God said, get up and start walking. Get to stepping, buddy. But not with Israel. When Israel, as a people, were led out of Egypt, they had a destination. They knew where they were going. Do you know where they were going? Most of you do. That's right. They were headed to the promised land. That was the land that God had promised to Abraham, that he would give to Abraham's descendants as their homeland forever. But when Israel first entered Egypt, they couldn't take over a small city, let alone a huge territory like the Promised Land. And when they first came to Egypt, there were only 70 or 75 of them. But centuries later, when they left, they were a huge nation. Their fighting force alone was more than 600,000 men. Not men and women, not old people and young, fighting men from the ages of 20 to 50, the Torah says. Fighting men, more than 600,000. They go, okay, so what? Wasn't a million. Let's put this into perspective, those kind of numbers. During the American Revolution, those of you know I'm a bit of a war buff, history buff about wars, and myself spent 5 years in the military in the 82nd Airborne Division. But during the American Revolution, when Washington fought against England, the Revolutionary Army rarely numbered more than around 20,000 men. Right? So you're 600,000 fighting men. You're like, How about World War II? D-Day. The Allied forces landed at Normandy with about 156,000 men. Oh, it's the biggest invasion of the world. No, it was not. 600,000 fighting men. If I was a soldier in Pharaoh's army, and he said, chase the Israelites who were at the edge of the sea and kill them all, I would go, are you nuts? There's 600,000 fighting men over there. You must be kidding. I quit. Resignation. You can keep your Medal of Honor. I'm going that way. Bye. That's a lot of men. 600,000. But when Israel left Egypt, these 600,000 men were capable of fighting their enemies. But they had been oppressed under Egyptian slavery for so long, they didn't realize the power that had been given to them and how strong they were. And they cowered in fear and said, Moses, what will we do? Moses lifts his hands to God. And God says, don't cry to me. Raise your staff and part the sea. He had been given the power. Didn't realize it. Stood in the face of God and did not know the power he had already been given. Exodus 1 verse 12 says about the Israelites, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. The more they multiplied and spread. Not only did they grow into a huge nation under their slavery, but the harsh work they were doing, forced to do, that made them a mighty people. They were strong now. They weren't a bunch of starving vagabundos coming in from another land, and they, from Canaan with Jacob and the few people, and they were starving and they came there to get food. This was a new nation. This was the descendants of Israel. They had been oppressed for 400 years into very hard labor. I wonder, I don't know how many people of you are old enough to remember Arnold Schwarzenegger playing the part of Conan the Barbarian in the movie. Did you ever see that? So he's captured by the enemy army, right? And he's captured by them, and they sell him into slavery. And he's chained to a huge kind of turning wheel that grinds grain or something, right? And he's tied to it, and he has to push it. So he's a little skinny, malink kid when it starts. And then they show him, and it says, I don't know how many years pass, and they show him, 20 years later, whatever. And he's this massive, muscle-bound thing, looks like Samson pushing this thing. No problem. Right? Year after year, he's using every muscle in his body to push that. It's made him cut, built, strong, formidable, powerful. Israel was now capable of standing on their own if called to war, which they were not before. So it was the chains of slavery that made Israel ready to take hold of what God had promised them. Secondly, when God sent the Israelites down into Egypt, he sent them there out of the influence of other nations in the land. Out of their influence. Remember, Abraham came from a place and a family, Ur of the Chaldeans, right? He came from a place where idolatry reigns. They had idols, many different gods, many different idols. And he came away from that. You can see the issues with his descendants, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, having issues and swearing away from idolatry. They wouldn't have any part of it. So God is taking them away and taking them into a certain place where they would be separated. You see, under Joseph's reign, the Israelites were given the land of Goshen. And see, the Israelites, they were never really a part of Egypt. You could say, no, they were a part of Egypt under Joseph, but no, they were not. You got to read the story again. You see, the Egyptians were vegetarians. They despised meat eaters, and that's exactly what the people of Israel were. There was no way you could have flocks and herds of animals and be anywhere near the Egyptians. They found it disgusting. Israel never fit in with the Egyptian culture. Someone shut that door for me, please. In fact, when Pharaoh gave them the land of Goshen to live in it, it was because the Egyptians really didn't want that land. It wasn't good for raising crops. The land of Goshen was a terrible place to raise crops. But it was great. It was good ground for grazing cattle and sheep. Not so good for planting. And so even before they were made slaves in Egypt, the people of Israel were isolated from Egypt's culture, from the gods of Egypt, from the immorality that Egypt and other nations engaged in. The land of Goshen was kind of on the south side of any region of other powerful nations. This insulated Israel from the ebb and flow of other cultures and other religions, other beliefs, other practices. That's what holy means. It means to be separate, apart, other than. So, when they emerged from their slavery, they were prepared to be shaped and molded by God, broken down, but strengthened, ready to be molded in what God had for them, the purpose he had for them. They did not worship the gods of Egypt, not after hundreds of years of slavery to the Egyptians. They didn't live in the lifestyle of the Egyptians, even after being there for several centuries. They were a people that had been set apart from the world around them by God. And they were prepared to be shaped by God's kind of morality and God's kind of lifestyle. Thirdly, some Christian scholars say that Israel remained in slavery for as long as they did because they never asked God to free them. I have great difficulty trying to believe that view. I believe that it was about God's own timing and God's own purpose for Israel. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be slaves for 400 years. It had already been spoken. It had already been determined. God had said it was going to happen. God doesn't change his mind. That means that Israel's slavery had a timing and it had a purpose. There was a reason for this. Now, Yeshua of Nazareth, our Messiah, taught that he would free us. In John 8:36, he says, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. That's why Yeshua came and died for us, to free us, to release us from our chains, from our bondage. So if Yeshua came to free us, then everything should be sweetness and light, shouldn't it? But is that how it works? Is that really how it works? Do you see sweetness and light for his apostles and disciples? Is that what their future was, or was it death for almost all of them? Are your lives completely free of troubles now that you believe in Yeshua? Are you free of difficulties? Are you free of hardships, trials, challenges? Life isn't always pleasant and pain-free, is it? Why is that? Well, part of the answer lies in the fact that we live in a fallen world. And as long as we live in this world, we're going to encounter suffering and trials and difficulties. In fact, Yeshua, our Messiah, Son of the living God, in John 16:33, teaches us this. He says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. And in 1 Peter, we're told, dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come upon you to test you, and though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Messiah, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. 1 Peter chapter 4. Trouble, fiery ordeals, suffering. Wait a minute. I don't want that. I didn't sign up for that. Nobody told me that when they say, if you say this prayer, we believe you're saved, put your hand in the Bible, receive Yeshua. Wait a minute, where did it go? I don't remember that anywhere in the program. But that's how life happens, isn't it? That's what Yeshua said would happen. There are many things that weigh us down and put us in bondage. And there may even be times when God will permit us to be bound in chains. There may be times when God allows chains in our lives. Maybe they're not physical chains. Maybe they're not shackles. Maybe they're not handcuffs. The reasons he would do that to us are the very reasons that caused Israel to suffer in their bondage. Excuse me a second. My chains. This is a real chain. It can bind a man and you can't break out of it, not unless you can turn into Hulk. We don't know. So I'm bound in these chains. And what are they? What do they represent in my life? But for each of us, we have a chain. It may not be as visible as this chain. We may not be able to see it as real and clear as we see this. But yet it is there for us. It's as real as if we could see it. There are chains in our life, chains that bind us, chains that enslave us. You know, first God allows Israel's chains for a time so that they could become stronger to break free of the chains with his help. But it was to prepare to take hold of what God wants us to truly have in our lives. You're bound but for a time. One person put it this way: no pressure, no diamonds. You know, when a diamond is in the raw, it doesn't look all that pretty. It's through many, many, many years of pressure that comes through the ground, right? Seismic pressure, you could say, that grinds it and pushes it together. And then when the diamond is harvested and polished, then it becomes beautiful. And women want to see a little one of those, or a big one, on the ring before they say, I do. Or in some cases, I don't. Fitness buffs. I don't know how many of you here are into physical fitness. If you are, you probably have heard the expression, no pain, no gain. Right? What does that mean? The more you work out, the more you push yourself, the stronger you're going to be. Have any of you ever heard of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder? It's a condition that describes people who've gone through such a terrible experience in their lives that it unsettles them and throws their life off balance. Now, in 1995, researchers at the Trinity Western University in Canada found that such trauma can actually be beneficial if it's handled correctly. They call the phenomena PTG, or post-traumatic growth. Amongst other things, they found that trauma growth resulted in gratitude for being alive, positive changes in their priorities, stronger religious spiritual beliefs, a sense of control and security through their belief in God, greater meaning in their lives, a stronger belief in their own competence and self-reliance, improved relationships with people they cared about, and finally, increased compassion and empathy for others. It's almost like somebody goes to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you got 6 months to live. And the person walks out of the doctor's office and they're looking at the sky and they're looking at the trees. And they hear a bird tweet and they're listening to it and watching the bird. Everything, all of a sudden, the littlest things have meaning. Even the wind that blows through the trees and you watch it. Every sound, every smell. You realize life is short. It's a different view. Remember the priest, the doctor, and the lawyer? 3 different views, right? But their trauma for the Israelites changed them and strengthened them and made them into a much stronger people. And one of those things I noticed in the article was that these folks became stronger because of their faith in God. A lot of the people with PTG or PTSD became stronger when they had faith. Do you know it's a proven scientific fact that even an atheist who doesn't believe in God, he's in the hospital about to go through an operation that maybe might take his life or might save him, and they don't know. It's one of those iffy things, 50-50. He's going to go through it. Do you know if he knows or she knows that someone's going to pray for them? Even though they don't believe in God, it's a proven fact that they do better because they know someone's praying for them. Isn't that a miracle? God used the chains that bound others to strengthen the lives of those who looked to God for their help. So first, God allowed Israel's chains so that they could become stronger. We need to understand the why of that slavery. He allowed their chains to protect them from the things of this world, to isolate them from the influences of this world. And you know, I don't know how many of you have had this experience when you were kids, but when I was younger, I wasn't very well liked. It hurt. I wanted to be part of the in crowd, but they didn't want any part of me. They didn't want me around. I was kind of like the nerd. I hungered to be liked and accepted, but it wasn't to be. It was like being bound in chains. I couldn't be freed to be accepted, included, and liked. And years later, I was talking with a band director. I used to play trumpet in school. I was talking to the band director, and I shared with her how difficult my high school years were being, and she sympathized with me and then shared that my class had been one of the roughest classes she'd experienced in her teaching career. And looking back, not being in the in crowd may not have been such a bad thing for me. The chains that bound me so that I couldn't join their lifestyle had also insulated me and isolated me from being involved in things that I would probably have learned to later regret. The parties, the alcohol, drugs, and who wants to think about what else? My chains of rejection protected me from the things that would have hurt me on a permanent basis. And lastly, thirdly, God allowed Israel's chains because they needed to be reminded of their need for Him. How easy it is to forget Him. God has abandoned me. He doesn't care about me. Look at how long he's left me and my ancestors in slavery. Look at how X amount of people have died in my family. So and so is sick, etc. God doesn't care. God doesn't love me. God wanted to remind them to need him in their lives. Israel couldn't free themselves from their chains, and neither can we. Our chains will drag us down and even knock us down. Someone once said, sometimes God allows us to be knocked down, so all we can do is look up. What I found intriguing about this Parsha was that God used Israel's chains to prepare them for freedom. You know, sometimes somebody is given something, especially kids, teens. They're given something, and you worked hard for it. You buy them maybe a computer. You don't care about it. 3 months later, you're like, how's the computer? Well, I spilled coffee on it. I dropped it. I left it at a friend's house. I dropped it under a taxi. Whatever. Wait a minute. The computer was like $1,000. Sometimes something happens too easy, too quick. We tend not to appreciate it. But if you had to work, 4 weeks to be able to afford to buy that thing, all of a sudden it has more value for you. And you treat it with more respect. See, it was when God gave Israel's chains, when Israel gave their chains to God, that God used their chains to free them and give them the strength to succeed. The strength to succeed. Israel, the sons of Jacob, did not walk into Egypt with 600,000 fighting men. I wonder how many of you here have ever read the Tales of Narnia. The book, The Tales of Narnia. The movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was inspired based on this book by C.S. Lewis. But he has another book that I had come across called The Great Divorce. And in this story, he tells the imaginary story of people who take a bus trip from hell to visit heaven. It's an interesting book, The Great Divorce. You can check it out. And on their visit, they would be given the opportunity to renounce hell and travel to the fountain of life and to live for eternity. And the unique thing about heaven was that it was real and hell wasn't. And it wasn't that hell wasn't real at all. It was composed of that which was solid. It wasn't. But heaven was. It was solid. It was real. When the visitors stepped off the bus, they saw how real heaven was compared to hell. The grass penetrates their feet. If they tried to step into a river, they found that they couldn't step into it. They stepped onto it. And it would carry them downstream before they realized what had happened. Still carrying my chains here. I could feel the weight. The book told the stories of individuals who struggled with accepting heaven and rejoining their past in hell. They were struggling between those two things. And one amazing part of the story was when one of these visitors was returning to the bus. On his shoulder, there was a lizard who chatted annoyingly in his ear as they walked. Suddenly, a huge flaming angel stepped from the bushes and startled him. And the angel asked if he would like for him to make the lizard be quiet. And the man replied that he would like that. And the angel then explained to do that, he would have to kill the lizard. And this began a conversation where the man expressed fear that killing the lizard would hurt him and maybe even kill him. And the angel explained that he had never said it wouldn't hurt him to kill the lizard, but it would not kill him. And the man finally admits that it would be better to be dead than to live with this creature. The angel sees the lizard, and the story continues, and this is quoting right from the book. The next moment, the ghost gave a scream of agony, which I've never heard on earth, and the burning one closed his crimson grip on the reptile, twisted it, while it bit and writhed, and then flung it, broken back on the turf. Ow! "That's done for me," gasped the ghost, reeling backwards. For a moment, I could make out nothing distinctly. And then I saw between me and the nearest bush, unmistakably solid, but growing every moment solider, the upper arm and the shoulder of a man. And then brighter still and stronger, the legs and hands. And the neck and golden head materialized while I watched. As if my attention had not wavered, I should have seen the actual completing of a man, an immense man, not much smaller than the angel. And what distracted me was the fact that at the same moment, something seemed to be happening to the lizard. At first I thought the operation had failed. So far from dying, the creature was still struggling and even growing bigger as it struggled. And as it grew, it changed, and its hinder parts grew rounder. The tail, still flickering, became a tail of hair. And suddenly I started back, rubbing my eyes. What stood before me was the greatest stallion I had ever seen, silvery white, but with a mane and tall of gold. And it was smooth and shining and rippled with swells of flesh and muscle, whinnying and stamping with its hoofs. At each stamp, the land shook and the trees kindled. And the man expressed his thanks to the angel, now freed from his torment, climbed onto the stallion that had been his sin, and rode it into the growing sunrise towards the Savior. What was the point of the story? The point is that the creature had held this man in the chains of sin and was used by God to give that man the strength and power and the ability to walk with his deliverer. His very chains became the source of overcoming sin. Now, we talk a little bit about sin before we close today. God hates sin. For example, he hates murder. And we could say, oh yeah, murder's wrong. Abortion is murder. Now, the world out there will tell you, oh no, it's not. Until it's born, it's not a person. Until it's X amount of weeks old, it's not a person. As far as I'm concerned, as soon as there's a heartbeat, it's a person. And moreover, God has a different opinion than I have. God's opinion is what matters, not mine, not ours, not the mayors, not the governors, not the presidents. God's opinion is what matters. God says, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you. Before it was formed, before it was a heartbeat, it was a person. Killing it's wrong. Another example, God hates homosexuality. Leviticus 18 verse 22, God says, you shall not lie with a man as you lie with a woman. It is an abomination. But we live in a place and time where murder of an unborn baby is okay by the masses. Homosexuality, lesbianism is okay for the masses. But God and us, it is an abomination. It is sin. But there is good news. And the good news is that everyone has that possibility of casting off those chains of sin and bondage. Turning their life around and saying, God, you're right. I'm wrong. From this day forward, I'm going to live your way, not my way. Whatever we think is right or wrong, whatever the masses accept, we have to make a choice. Are we going to live a righteous way that God asks us to? Or are we going to go our own way? There are many people who come to a congregation and just play the game. They view their congregation as a social club and the worship service as some religious duty. They don't live victorious Messianic lives because they are bound in the chains that they have never given over to God. And God freed Israel from the bondage of slavery. Messiah came to free us from the bondage of sin, from the chains of our lives. And I'm coming to my closure here. We can never be free of those chains until we make up our minds to give them over to God. We've got to take them and we've got to give them to Him and say, God, I cannot live this way. You take it. I I cannot carry. We have to get to the point where we surrender these chains to Yeshua. In Exodus 33, verse 14, God says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And in Matthew 11, verse 28, Yeshua himself says, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That's freedom. You can't handle it. You can't break it. You really want to quit smoking, but you can't do it. He will help you. Give your chains of burden to him. Because once we do that, once we give those chains to him that we cannot carry, that we cannot break away from that sin, that wrong, then he will help us. Once we are able to do that, to give our chains of burden to him, the ones which bound us will become our source of strength, because we will have discovered the freedom from bondage that only God can give through Yeshua HaMashiach, Yeshua of Nazareth, our Savior. Shabbat Shalom.